The eastern Pacific Ocean, a vast and often tranquil expanse, has now become the latest and most unexpected battleground in America's rapidly escalating military campaign against suspected drug traffickers, a campaign that has drawn both attention and controversy from around the world. On November 4, 2025, the U.S. military confirmed a lethal strike that destroyed a small vessel in international waters, killing both people aboard. The incident unfolded hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, far from the eyes of the public, and with little warning. This marks the 16th such attack since the Trump administration launched its aggressive new policy in September, expanding operations from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The shift signals a dramatic broadening of the U.S. military's reach, as authorities claim to target transnational criminal networks operating far from American shores. Pentagon details remain sparse, with officials citing classified intelligence but offering no public evidence to support claims of drug trafficking. The lack of transparency has only deepened skepticism among international observers and legal experts. The method of the strike and the identities of the victims remain undisclosed, fueling international debate over legality and morality. Critics question whether due process is being observed, or if these are simply targeted killings carried out under the cover of secrecy. Human rights groups argue these actions amount to extrajudicial killings, as the death toll climbs to at least 67. They warn that such operations set a dangerous precedent, undermining international law and human rights protections. The Pacific's quiet waters have become a front line in a shadowy conflict, raising urgent questions about accountability, the rules of engagement, and the true cost of this expanding war on drugs. In Washington, officials frame the campaign as a necessary war to protect American lives, describing it as a fight for the nation's future. They argue that the stakes have never been higher, with communities across the country suffering from the devastating impact of narcotics. The rhetoric is urgent, painting the battle against drug cartels as a matter of national survival. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth insists intelligence confirmed the vessel's involvement in drug smuggling, emphasizing the sophistication and reach of these criminal organizations. He points to a growing network of traffickers who use advanced technology and international connections to evade law enforcement. Hegseth vows to eliminate every threat, promising that the U.S. military will pursue those responsible wherever they operate. He assures the public that no effort will be spared in dismantling these networks. The Trump administration's reclassification of major cartels as foreign terrorist organizations allows the U.S. to treat suspects as enemy combatants, bypassing arrest and trial. This move grants sweeping new powers to law enforcement and the military, enabling rapid and aggressive action. President Trump's rhetoric has shifted the strategy from interdiction to annihilation, calling for a relentless campaign to destroy cartel operations at their source. He frames the fight as a moral imperative, urging Americans to support bold new measures. The administration argues that only military force can dismantle these networks, insisting that traditional law enforcement methods are no longer sufficient. Military leaders coordinate complex operations, deploying troops and resources to target cartel strongholds. The administration claims previous efforts failed, citing years of rising overdose deaths and persistent trafficking. They argue that incremental changes have not stemmed the tide of drugs entering the country. Officials now insist that only decisive action can stop the flow of narcotics, pointing to recent high-profile busts as evidence of the need for a tougher approach. By labeling cartel members as terrorists, officials seek to rally public support and sidestep legal challenges, hoping to unite the country behind a common enemy and justify extraordinary measures. Critics warn this approach blurs the line between law enforcement and warfare, raising concerns about civil liberties and the potential for abuse of power. They question whether military tactics are appropriate for domestic issues. The government maintains those killed are enemy combatants, not civilians, arguing that these individuals pose a direct threat to national security and must be dealt with accordingly. Officials justify lethal force as essential for national security, insisting that extraordinary threats demand extraordinary responses and that the safety of Americans must come first. In Latin America's coastal towns, families of the dead reject the U.S. narrative, insisting their loved ones were innocent fishermen, not traffickers. Survivors and relatives describe a campaign that kills without warning or evidence, leaving communities devastated and stigmatized. A Colombian fisherman, one of the few survivors, claims his boat was only for fishing, echoing similar stories from other families. No physical evidence of drugs or weapons has been presented by U.S. officials, deepening skepticism. Critics argue the lack of transparency means the world is asked to trust U.S. claims as the death toll rises. Families face not only grief, but financial ruin, losing breadwinners and boats. Their search for justice highlights the human cost and the gulf between official statements and lived reality. The divide grows as pleas for accountability clash with Washington's silence. The scale of the U.S. campaign is unprecedented, with at least 16 strikes and 17 vessels destroyed since September. The attacks, including one on a semi-submersible, signal a shift from interdiction to total elimination of targets. Fatalities are nearly absolute: 67 dead, only 3 survivors, underscoring the campaign's lethal intent. The operation has rapidly expanded from the Caribbean to the Pacific, targeting routes along the entire western coast of the Americas. October saw a major escalation, with coordinated missile strikes killing 14 in a single day. This systematic, centrally directed effort signals a long-term strategy, not isolated incidents. The offensive's reach and intensity have surprised international observers, raising questions about its ultimate goals. The message is clear: no maritime route is beyond the reach of American military power. Alongside the strikes, the U.S. has launched a major military buildup in Latin America, projecting power across the region. The redeployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Group, destroyers, F-35 jets, and thousands of troops marks the largest U.S. military presence in decades. These assets provide surveillance, command, and rapid response, signaling readiness for sustained operations. The show of force aims to deter cartels and pressure uncooperative governments, especially Venezuela. For many Latin American nations, the buildup revives memories of U.S. intervention and is seen as a threat to sovereignty. Instead of enhancing security, the deployment risks destabilizing the region and escalating tensions. The anti-drug campaign has become a strategic realignment, not just a series of strikes. The consequences for regional stability are unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The U.S. campaign has triggered fierce backlash from Venezuela and Colombia, both countries now finding themselves at the very center of the new and controversial policy. Across both nations, citizens have taken to the streets in protest, voicing anger and concern over what they see as foreign interference in their domestic affairs. The sense of outrage is palpable, with leaders and ordinary people alike demanding respect for their sovereignty and the right to determine their own futures. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has been especially vocal, accusing the U.S. of using anti-drug operations as a pretext for regime change and for seeking greater control over Venezuela's vast oil reserves. He argues that Washington's actions are not about fighting crime, but about exerting political and economic dominance in the region. Maduro firmly denies that Venezuela is a drug producer, insisting his government actively combats traffickers and works to keep illegal substances out of the country. He frames the U.S. campaign as a direct act of aggression, designed to destabilize his administration and undermine national security. In neighboring Colombia, President Gustavo Petro has also spoken out forcefully. He condemns the recent killing of Colombian fishermen, insisting they were innocent victims caught in the crossfire of escalating tensions. Petro has called for a thorough investigation and justice for the families affected. The diplomatic crisis has put immense strain on U.S.-Colombia relations, with President Trump threatening to cut vital aid in response to Petro's criticism. Behind closed doors, officials on both sides are scrambling to prevent a complete breakdown in cooperation. Colombia now faces a difficult dilemma: how to defend its citizens and assert its independence, without jeopardizing the crucial U.S. support that underpins much of its security and economic stability. The stakes for the country's future could not be higher. The fallout from the U.S. campaign is deepening divisions across Latin America, making it harder for regional leaders to find common ground and undermining efforts at cooperation on shared challenges. Traditional alliances are beginning to fray as the human cost of the campaign mounts. Communities are left grieving, and the sense of unity that once existed among neighbors is now under threat. Across the region, uncertainty and anxiety are growing. Latin America is left grappling with the far-reaching consequences of America's unilateral actions, as leaders and citizens alike search for a path forward in an increasingly divided landscape. International human rights organizations have condemned the U.S. strikes as violations of international law and due process. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch demand an immediate halt, calling the killings extrajudicial. They challenge the legal basis for treating cartel suspects as enemy combatants, arguing drug trafficking is not armed conflict. Lawmakers in the U.S. have joined the outcry, calling for congressional hearings and greater transparency. Critics warn the policy sets a dangerous precedent for state-sanctioned killings. Demands for accountability focus on the need for public evidence and clear rules of engagement. The secrecy surrounding the campaign is seen as an attempt to avoid scrutiny. Until the administration provides lawful justification, condemnation is likely to intensify. The United Nations has joined the chorus of concern, with the High Commissioner for Human Rights labeling the U.S. strikes as extrajudicial killings. The UN urges the U.S. to halt attacks and comply with international human rights law, emphasizing the right to life and legal safeguards. The campaign's reliance on secret intelligence and lack of judicial oversight is seen as a violation of global norms. The UN calls for impartial investigations into civilian deaths and reparations for victims' families. This intervention elevates the issue to a global stage, challenging the U.S. to address evidence of civilian harm. The UN's condemnation isolates the U.S. and questions its commitment to the international order. Further action within the UN system is possible, increasing diplomatic pressure. The world is watching as the U.S. faces mounting calls for accountability. The U.S. campaign marks a dramatic shift from law enforcement to military annihilation in the war on drugs. Effectiveness remains unproven as cartels adapt and the drug flow continues. Civilian deaths risk fueling anti-American sentiment and recruitment for criminal groups. The legal and ethical precedents set by unilateral strikes on non-state actors are deeply troubling. Could this logic be used against other groups or by other nations, eroding international law? The campaign forces a reckoning with its long-term costs, diplomatic fallout, moral standing, and civilian safety. As the death toll rises, the world waits for answers. Will this new doctrine bring security or unleash greater chaos?